I want to make 3 points this morning. And if you remember nothing else from what I say today, I'd ask that it is these 3 things. The first is that we now live in an era of innovation wars. Whether you are in business or on the battlefield, your competitive differentiation comes not from any given product, service, or capability, but from your ability to continuously innovate and scale your innovations. The second is that the pace of technological change is now such that it's no longer good enough to follow technology trends. You have to have a theory of winning. Again, whether you're in markets or military, if you attempt to follow the technology trends, you'll see them continuously race away as the lag gets greater and greater. The only way to keep up is to start ahead, and that means having a very clear theory of winning. How am I going to compete? How am I going to win at day X? It means, in Jeff Bezos' famous words, thinking backwards from that future that you wish to build, and thinking forwards to imagine it clearly. So the second thing, innovation wars is the first thing, and theory of winning is the second. The third and the most important, and the thing that I will spend most time talking about this morning, because I think it's the most provocative of the 3 propositions, is that we are approaching, both for companies and countries, a point of potential innovation escape velocity, whereby if you don't win in AI, and specifically the fields of generative design and automated manufacturing, you will fall further and further behind. If you lose that competitive advantage in generative design and automated manufacturing, you may never regain it. You'll get innovation and scientific runaways. On the other hand, if you gain it first, you may never lose it. And I think that's a profound change in both market competition and military competition. Let's come first to this idea of innovation wars. The first thing you might say to me is, well, all right, Keith, but like, what's new about any of this? You know, if you look at Murray and Knox's brilliant book, The Dynamics of Military Revolutions, they show how multiple new technologies have entered service, going back as far as the longbow, Agincourt and Crécy, all the way through to the modern times. And in fact, we could go back further to ancient Greece and the introduction of the catapult. What's different is right up until the First World War, the technology came first and the tactics came second. We would take many years to figure out how we were going to maximally apply those technologies in battle to ensure their effectiveness. What happens now is that the technology is much, much faster than the tactics. And by the start of the First World War, I'd suggest that has changed. Now, before I come to that example, let me also make clear this is just as relevant for companies as it is for countries. In the 1950s, the average life of a company was on the S&P 500 was 60 years. Most companies that were on the S&P 500 had lasted for 60 years. Today, the Santa Fe Institute estimates, argues and analyzes that today the average is 10 years for the life of a company across the S&P 500. That is Schumpeter's creative destruction, continuously eating those companies alive because they don't innovate fast enough, because they're trying to hold on to a product or service as a differentiation rather than ensuring their innovation system continuously keeps them ahead. It's not what you sell, it's how you innovate that matters, in the words of the Santa Fe Institute. What's quite neat, I think, and I didn't know this when I started writing the talk, is that we can ground that change in the nature of warfare, where it's innovation that matters more than the capability itself, to the place where we're standing today. On the screen you see an image of course, Winston Churchill, but to his left, the perhaps today slightly lesser known character of the Prof, Frederick Linderman. Professor Linderman was born in Germany to a German father, and so at the outbreak of the First World War, he struggled to get a commission to go and serve on the front as he wanted. But he was a physicist, a scientist, and, as a side, a Wimbledon competitor, which surely is an unusual combination of skills. Linderman applied multiple times for his commission, didn't get it, but he also kept writing to the War Office. The first thing he said was, as a physicist, I've got this idea. What if you lowered a microphone, a waterproof microphone underwater? Would that enable you to detect submarines and ships at scale? And the War Office went, we don't need one of those. And then he came back and he wrote again. He said, hang on a minute, I've got another idea. What if we used acoustic detection to figure out where artillery and machine guns were? So acoustic range finding and direction finding. And then the War Office said, nah, we don't need one of those. And he applied again and again and again. He wrote to the War Office and they were not interested. And eventually, a man called Major Brankner, who had been in charge, or had been in the Royal Flying Corps, responsible for their technical innovation, who you might know, because he later went on to be Air Air Marshal Sefton Brankner, responsible for, among other things, the setting up of flying clubs all around the country to drive innovation in the civil sector in order to push the Royal Air Force further, something I wrote about for the Wavell Room this morning. So Sefton Brankner hired Linderman and a whole load of other scientists to come work here at Farnborough in what was then the Royal Aircraft Factory, so the first RAF, preceding the Royal Air Force. And in 1915, Linderman started work. Now, to give you an idea of how things were at the time, one of his colleagues, I think it was Dobson, Professor Dobson was his name, when he started work here, got in touch with the War Office again. He said, hey, I figured out this way of predicting the weather. It's extremely effective. And he managed to convince the major that he was talking to that all of the science was sound, that he could indeed predict the weather far more accurately than he'd been able to before. And then he said, look, if we could cable these weather forecasts to the front and to the headquarters, wouldn't that be really useful for military planning in what we now know as the First World War? And this guy said, no, not really. He said, if I've got the quote here, he said that soldiers don't go to war under an umbrella. It doesn't matter whether it's raining or not, they're going to fight anyway. So why on earth would we need a weather forecast? Now, I ask you to remember this poor beleaguered chap at the War Office and his rejection of the utility of weather forecasts in war before many men, of course, died in the mud at the Somme, not in order to show him up, but because he had an excuse. Warfare up until 1914 had principally been about technology coming after the tactics. Technology was invented and then we figured out how we used it. In the First World War, that changed. Here at Farnborough, Linderman and the Royal Aircraft Factory came up with ideas for how you could cut balloon cables, which were then a form of air defence by fitting devices on the front of aircraft. They came up, testing their hypotheses by getting in the aircraft and flying them, with figuring out how you could get out of a spiral spin when an aircraft stalled, for the first time developing the science, reading the instruments as their aircraft plummeted to the ground, knowing that many professional pilots had died just days before doing the same thing. They came up with ideas for how you could detect vessels using radiation. They came up with ideas for how you could use infrared for detecting ships and aircraft. They came up with the acoustic detection of submarines and the acoustic detection of range and detection finding for artillery and guns, as I mentioned. Linderman's biographer, though, writes that it's difficult to avoid the picture of a reservoir of bright ideas from factory scientists lapping fruitlessly against the stolid dam of the War Office mind. Most of these ideas, with the exception of the stalling aircraft solution, never made it into service and indeed weren't worked on until World War II. Linderman went on to develop a relationship with Churchill, who was so impressed with the bravery he'd shown in pulling aircraft out of spins that he began to work really closely with Linderman and to take his ideas for how science would change warfare really seriously. Together they wrote in an article in 1924 entitled "Shall We All Commit Suicide?", worrying about the effect of scientific warfare. In this article, they wrote, the possession today by one side of some overwhelming scientific advantage would lead to the complete enslavement of the unwary party. Not only are the powers now in the hands of man capable of destroying the life of nations, but for the first time they afford one group of civilized men the opportunity of reducing their opponents to absolute helplessness. Now then, they were writing a paean for peace in the aftermath of the First World War. But by 1934, when it was very obvious to a great many people, but Churchill in particular, that war was coming, Linderman and Churchill started a campaign to overcome the defeatist mindset that was arguing that the bomber would always get through. In 1944, Linderman wrote the letter that you see on the screen to the Times, and he argued after a parliamentary debate, it said, look, we just have to accept bombers will always get through and cities are going to be destroyed. He said, this problem is far too important and urgent to be left to the casual endeavours of individuals or departments. The whole weight and influence of the government should be thrown into the scale to endeavour to find a solution. All decent men and all honourable governments are equally concerned to obtain a security against attacks from the air, and to achieve it, no effort and no sacrifice is too great. He was arguing to transform defence with technology that did not exist, but which he could write a feasible and defensible hypothesis for how it could be built. Now, Linderman's efforts, along with Churchill's, led to the creation of the Tizard Committee. The Tizard Committee famously is accredited with having driven forward the development of the Dowding system, technology that at the time did not exist. The Dowding system credited with helping to save Britain in the Second World War. And the influence of Linderman and this ability to imagine what the future looked like and build it was such that he was able to burst that stolid dam of the War Office mind by being, it is said, perhaps the greatest influence on Winston Churchill in the Second World War. His right-hand man throughout it, constantly coming up with new ideas and driving the science that ultimately enabled the victory. So my argument is, therefore, that things have fundamentally changed, and you see that more recently. In 1978, DARPA came up with the idea of assault breaker. This was answering the question, how do we solve the problem of the huge number of second echelon forces that the Soviets are going to pour into Europe if we were to go to war and the Cold War were to turn hot? And they came up with, this is a fairly familiar image, we might today call it network-enabled warfare, network-enabled capability, the idea of connecting things, the idea of precision strike. And they started by saying, hey, lots of these technologies don't exist. We can't fly aircraft at night and in bad weather. We can't acquire targets when they're moving. We can't acquire vehicles at night. We can't acquire them through cloud. We can't acquire them when they're moving in and out of complex terrain. But they figured out what they needed and they built it. The J-Stars came out of this concept for how you would fight. So too the Global Hawk and UAVs, surface-to-surface missile systems. The F-15E was designed for long-range strike in order to be able to destroy those follow-on forces. The Apache was built in order to enable a capability, technology that did not exist. And lastly, and really importantly, multi-role F-16s, also designed and built in order to enable this theory of winning. The theory of winning was thinking backwards from the problem and figuring out what we needed. Here I'm struck as I walk around Farnborough, there are some incredible technologies, but it's like we've got all the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and no idea what the picture looks like for how it will be when it's fully assembled. We need that theory of winning if we're to transform defence with technology that does not exist. And the reason I think that is so important is that today we have reached innovation escape velocity, where if you don't get ahead, you might stay behind and never regain it, but if you do get ahead, others might never catch you up. Let me try and convince you that that controversial proposition is true. Every major breakthrough in AI up until about 2018 came through increases in computational power. It was essentially the same algorithms that had been developed in the 1980s being applied with greater computational power. To give you an idea of the scale of that increase, between 2012 and 2018, we saw a 300,000 times increase in the volume of compute applied to training models. Now, others will have heard me say this, or some of you will have heard me say this before, but if your mobile phone battery had increased at the same rate, it would have gone from lasting 1 day on a single charge in 2012 to lasting 800 years by 2018. But the amount of computation applied since 2018 to 2024 would mean that it now lasted for 100 million years on a single charge. That's the scale of the increase in compute being applied to these models to train AI systems. Now, in 2018, when I first started giving these kind of presentations, you could argue that there'd been relatively little algorithmic innovation. That is no longer true. Without transformer models, without continuous innovation in the algorithms themselves, we wouldn't be where we are. What we have seen since 2016 is a 4,000 times increase in the efficiency of the algorithms that we apply. GPT Omni, or GPT-O, that was released just a few weeks ago, is 10 times more affordable than the models that came before it. It's 60% cheaper than the models. In 2 years, we have seen a 100% cost increase and a several times increase in performance in the algorithms that we apply in large language models and generative AI. The amount of data that we train models continues to increase exponentially, but such is the pace of development in AI that people have began to worry about 12 to 18 months ago that we might run out of data, that the computational power would increase, but we wouldn't have enough data to train us. That is no longer true. Increasingly, we're able to use synthetic data through techniques like from simple rules, statistical modeling, simulation, and you can see that it's now forecast that the synthetic data will be the dominant form of training of AI models in the future, so that constraint now gone. And to give you an idea of how much data AI is able to train on, if from the day you were born to the day you died, you did nothing but read, which of course you'd have to be quite a talented prodigy to do, you would be able to read, it's estimated, roughly 8 billion words. A large language model trains on 8 trillion words in a single month. So data is increasing and the ability of these models likewise. Similarly, development and costs of computer memory and storage continue to drop. Look at the straight lines on the graph. AI training costs continue to plummet, and so these things are becoming more efficient and more effective. Similarly, I've argued before that demography is no longer destiny. And to give you an idea of how that is the case, look at the number of employees required to generate $1 million in revenue on the S&P 500 from 1986 to today. Look at the amount of revenue generated per employee in the big tech companies. In Apple, that's $2.3 million per employee. In 2004, Blockbuster employed 84,000 people and generated $6 billion a year in revenue. In 2021, Netflix employed 15% as many people and generated 500% more in terms of revenue. On the screen, you see Moravec's Landscape of Human Competence, produced in the 1990s, in which he asked the question, when will computer hardware match the human brain? The rising tide of the sea is all those things that had once been argued. So the words show the things that it was once argued humans would ever be able to do, and they were overlaid on the landscape. And the rising tide is AI capabilities subsuming them. Things we said machines would never do that now they can. I started giving this presentation in 2018. All of those blue squares are things that since 2018, AI can now do that until relatively recently we said it would never be able to do. AI is now acing tests. So the grey line that you can maybe just about see on the screen here, where the text is human performance, you can see a whole range of areas in which AI now outperforms humans on these test scores, and increasingly so. We once said that AI would never be able to do advanced maths at the way that we can. At the International Maths Olympiad last year, a model built by DeepMind Alpha Geometry came second, and there's no reason, and we confidently expect it will be first in the future. So solving some of the hardest maths problems out there. And it's not just about linear increases in performance. We do get that, straight lines on graphs, look at the top. But we also get phase shifts, where things that we knew that once AI could do no better than chance, that it didn't know how to do, we increase the computational power, we increase the amount of data, we increase the number of parameters in the model, and we go from no better than chance to suddenly able to do. And all of those things at the bottom there, from maths, word problems to instruction following, they are things that previously AI could not do, increased computational power, and then suddenly those models were able to do. And we're not always able to know that in advance. So it's not just about the trends, but it's about the shifts as well. Why does that matter? Well, let me bring you back to my most controversial proposition. I think we're on the verge of scientific and innovation runaways. Increasingly, we have self-driving labs that can come up with a hypothesis, order the materials that are needed, and with relatively little human input, can run experiments at much faster than human speed, report the results, and then recursively start again, continuously innovating in science. If you were to go on to Google Scholar before 2018 and search for self-driving labs right up until 2018, you get 0 results. In 2024 so far, there have been 112. If you read the world's leading scientific journals, Science and Nature, you'll see a growing number of papers published with the support and assistance of self-driving labs. Google's GNOME, which is graph networks for materials exploration, is a model that they revealed to the world in December last year. It had, they claim, discovered, well not claim, it had been able to uncover over 421,000 new potential materials through the investigation of existing data. Previously, human experimentation in the entire history of materials science had come up with 20,000 potential new materials. DeepMind estimate that that's 380,000 years of knowledge created in just months with the application of GNOME to materials science. Why should you care? Materials science comes directly out of the Second World War. So MIT professor of materials science writing just 12 months ago says, look, it's the way in which multiple different fields came together to solve problems, to create new materials that could revolutionize warfare. Google have made all of those 421,000 new potential materials open source. Anyone can access them, scientists in China or Russia. It's a complete failure to understand how profoundly important this is. But it also means that we might well be right on the verge of those innovation runaways where we can just keep going recursively, designing new things through the application of increasingly effective systems. Again, to give you an idea of answering that question that Hans Moravec asked in 1997, how long until computers have the same power as the human brain? One author came up in 2016 with this estimate, which shows the exponentials, what those straight lines on graphs really mean. Remember, this was in 2016, and thank you, Al, for the graph, because this is a brilliant image for illustrating it. And what you'll see is that the estimate was 2025, projecting forwards, but of course they're exponentials. If you did that again, it might well be even sooner. So let me end in some ways where I began, back here at Farnborough. One of the things that Professor Frederick Linderman was working on here, I think really, it just couldn't be any better for this presentation. He said, writing a few years later, in this period, in 1915, Dr. Dobson and I did some work on what was probably the first automatic pilot. We were agreeably surprised to find that the first of these devices flew the plane about twice as accurately as a good pilot. So here at Farnborough, the birthplace, I would suggest, of uncrewed aircraft through the development of the world's first autopilot, Al and I, in a recent article, argued that the future is uncrewed. Now, we were talking about narrow AI, some of the things that are going on in the US with the flying of uncrewed F-16s in basic fighter maneuvers or dogfighting, suggest that there will be no pilots very soon in the world's most advanced aircraft. I suggest so too, there will be far fewer and perhaps no scientists in the lab. And at that point, what differentiates companies and countries is not the product, service, or capability that you have, but the speed and effectiveness of your automated manufacturing and your generative design. None of what I've said requires you to believe in science fiction. It requires you to believe in the lines on the graphs, many of which are straight, some of which are much more pronounced. On the left, you see an estimate from Our World in Data of human progress, the way we went round and round and round in circles for years. The Industrial Revolution, we began a takeoff, and now it's so rapid they have to squeeze it at the top to get that in. McKinsey describing the speed of innovation and disruption now, and technological advance now, compared to that of the Industrial Revolution. Say today it's taking place at 30 times the speed, with 300 times the scale, and 3,000 times the impact. It's for that reason I argue that today we are all, whether companies or countries, we are in innovation wars, with what differentiates you, your competitive advantage coming from your innovation system, no single capability, no single product, no single service. That the only way we will win is by transforming the military and indeed our companies with technology that doesn't exist, by developing a theory of winning that thinks backwards from where we need to get to and builds the things we need and allows us to keep pace with technology only by thinking forward. And finally, that we are on the brink of innovation escape velocity, and we cannot afford to be second in that race. We need to start investing now in generative design and generative manufacturing. We must win. If we lose, we may never regain the advantage. If we win, we may never lose it. And with that, I'll pause. I'm conscious that I have a fantastic panel that's going to immediately follow this. So I'm going to take 2 questions in case anyone should have a question after that. And then I shall move on and invite the panelists to join the stage, and we're going to talk about something slightly different, but perhaps linked in other ways. So if anyone does have a question, now's your chance to ask it. I think there's a microphone at the back. Darren, is this the heckling?
Hi, Keith, thank you. You said at the start we seem to have all the pieces of the puzzle, but not the picture. How do we get to that picture? How do we pull the parts together?
So I think it means thinking in constant trends and shifts. It means trying to be really rigorous in looking at the constants, those things we're confident won't change, and being willing to back yourself on them. Trends, those things that we can linearly project forwards, but we have high confidence in. And shifts, those things that we think that might happen, but which would profoundly change things, and then spreading your bets appropriately. And then ultimately, once you've done that, it's designing that theory of winning, to channel Air Marshal Edward at the back there, designing your theory of winning for next month, next year, and 5 years ahead, based on those projections. You know, I didn't refer to it, but on that final slide, I showed the estimates for when we will have AGI, AI at the level of 70th percentile human performance, Oracle AGI, that outperforms us in all cognitive domains, and ASI, that outperforms us in all cognitive domains and through robotics, so dexterity and locomotion. The years for those are 2027, 2029, and 2032. Now, that's the estimate based on Metaculus forecasts, the median estimate, which is the best way we have of understanding the future in a situation of uncertainty. So I don't say that you have to agree with me in all the things that I've said, but if you're betting against it, you should be clear on what it is, because it's not science fiction, it's straight lines on graphs. And therefore, as a company or as a country, if you're betting against it, well, you apply your asset allocation accordingly. You put your money, because all those people who are betting on it are in your mind wasting their money. So you should bet on the more prosaic constants and against those things. And that, again, means thinking, even then you're still thinking backwards. You're just saying, no, none of those things are going to happen, Keith, it's nonsense. I'm going to eat your company alive by investing in those things that won't change while you're investing in all those things that are never going to happen. So you didn't set that up, it allowed me to go back to, so thank you. Last chance for another question, and then I'll invite, Megan, thank you.
How do you view regulatory control by governments as a threat to the development of technology, and how that impedes your advantages as a country?
So I think, look, regulatory control is a risk, and I will answer your question directly, but I think the bigger risk is that stolid dam of the War Office mind has been rebuilt since the Second World War, and we need to find a way to break it down. In the Second World War, we did that by putting Professor Linderman, who was like a hugely disruptive individual. He got kicked off of the Tizard Committee for getting on everybody's nerves before coming back as the chief scientist and lead advisor to the Prime Minister. I think you need that kind of influence at the top of government to break the solid dam of the War Office mind again. Otherwise, it's all for the birds. I think on regulation, it does hold us back in multiple domains, and I think we will need to address that. But I think you need to address root causes first, and that means thinking about systems design and incentives that mean that it's usually in a regulator's interest to hold back progress rather than to enable it. So I would think one step beyond regulation, but absolutely regulation is a thing that we need to address. Great question. Thank you.